20 years later, how the 9/11 attack shaped American foreign policy over the last 2 decades, for better or worse.
Only after we understood better what the nature of the terrorist threat was did we become more careful and more precise. And I think those early mistakes really cost us.
And it's Friday. David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart discuss the anniversary of 9/11. Tonight, we've been marking the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Tonight, we look at how that day and its aftermath reconfigured America's role in the world. Judy Woodruff leads the conversation.
John, we want to step back a moment to ask whether the United States made the right decisions in response to the attacks and how 20 years later, those decisions have changed the way the United States fits into the international order. For that, we get 3 views. Robert Grenier had a 27-year career at the CIA and was the station chief in Pakistan and Afghanistan on 9/11. He played a key role in the U.S. ouster of the Taliban in 2001. He was also director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center from 2004 to 2006. He's now a consultant. Kori Schake worked on the National Security Council staff and then at the State Department during the George W. Bush administration. She's now Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And Frank Wisner had a many decades-long career in the Foreign Service. He was U.S. Ambassador to India and to Egypt, among other places. In the 1960s, he worked with the U.S. Agency for International Development in Vietnam. He's currently a Foreign Affairs advisor to the law firm Squire Patton Boggs. And we thank you all 3 for being back with us at the NewsHour. Robert Grenier, let me start with you. As we mentioned, you were in Southwest Asia when 9/11 happened. You were there watching this unfold. Looking back, did the U.S. make the right moves at that time?
I think we did. We often talk about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. In fact, it really wasn't an invasion at all. We only had a few hundred special forces operators and intelligence officers who were on the ground in Afghanistan, very importantly aided by U.S. close air support. But we came in very much with the idea that we needed to aid anti-Taliban Afghans to take charge of their own future. We departed from that model very seriously later on, but I think that we started out in the right way.
And Kori Schake, you, as I mentioned, joined the Bush administration, but it was after 9/11 when you did. Reflecting on that time, were the right decisions made?
You know, I think we made a lot of mistakes, actually, because we were acting out of fear. My strongest impression joining the Bush White House after September 11th was how fearful senior policymakers were that they hadn't kept America safe. And because we didn't understand the dimensions and even the nature of the threat we were facing, they made choices that were large and imprecise, and only after we understood better what the nature of the terrorist threat was did we become more careful and more precise. And I think those early mistakes really cost us.
But the initial mistake, the decision to go into Afghanistan, and then not long after into Iraq.
I don't think the decision to go into Afghanistan was a mistake, but I do think the decision to invade Iraq was a mistake of historic proportions.
Well, we can talk about that a little more. Frank Wisner, with the benefit of hindsight, what does it look like to you, whether there was wisdom in what the United States was doing at the time?
Well, I think as we look in hindsight, you're quite right to put it in that perspective, and the 2 previous remarks underscore the fear that we entertained as a nation. But I think I add one other point that's worth reflecting on, and that is a sense of arrogance, a sense that the United States could do what we ended up doing in Afghanistan, a sense of hegemony on the world stage coming out of the Cold War. And that lack of restraint, lack of sense of having to work in an international system meant that we were unleashed to act on our own. And that led to many of the mistakes that followed.
Robert Grenier, from your perspective, was there a sense at the time that that there was almost a hubris, an overconfidence on the part of the United States?
I think if we look at this over the span of 20 years, I very much agree with Ambassador Wisner that our reaction ultimately was disproportionate. That rather than aiding Afghans in a direction that we hoped would redound to our own interest as well, we essentially took over the entire endeavor. Afghanistan became too important to leave to Afghans. I think that what we tried to do involved expenditures, both in terms of money and blood, as well as risk that were ultimately greatly disproportionate to the actual national security interest involved.
Frank Wisner, I want to broaden this out to ask the three of you about what this experience of 9/11 has led to for the United States 20 years later. Is our country still in the place that it was? Obviously, it's 20 years later, but in terms of its leadership in the world, role in the world, how we are seen by other countries, how do you reflect on that?
Well, I reflect on it with some deep I feel very disturbed about it. I look back at these 20 years and I see our own domestic culture of tolerance having been eroded. I see a breakdown in our politics, which the war on terror certainly fed into. The trillions of dollars spent, not spent on public health and education and infrastructure in this country. I think we took our eye off the ball as China began to rise on the world stage, and we didn't react to that in time. And then we put ourselves in a position where we were a threat to the sovereignty of nations in the Middle East, where Muslim opinion in particular reacted negatively. So as we take a step back and look at it, the standing of the United States in the world today is diminished. And while that is the result of secular changes over many decades, the 9/11 response, the war on terror response, the way we went about it, that has significantly contributed to where we stand today, and we stand in a diminished place.
Kori Schake, do you see it the same way? The United States is diminished from what it was in 2001?
I think that's true internationally. I think we squandered an enormous amount of goodwill. If you think back to the reactions people and countries had right after September 11th, the enormous amount of goodwill for the United States, we squandered a lot of that with the policy choices we made in the aftermath in the next few years. And we dramatically underestimated how much soft power, the magnetism and attractiveness of American society really affect international attitudes about us. And it's very much in our national interest to rebuild that goodwill, because it makes everything we are trying to do in the world less expensive and easier.
Robert Grenier, does that say that what the United States should be doing now is forward-leaning? The U.S. should be thinking about how it leads, is the indispensable nation, or thinking more about how do we work with other countries?
Well, I would say both. I don't subscribe to the view that somehow the U.S. is completely discredited on the world stage. Obviously, I think we have diminished in terms of our image, but we remain the indispensable nation. There are things that we are doing that need to be done in the world that, frankly, only the United States still can do. I think it's most important, however, that we do it in conjunction with others. And I think withdrawing from the world is a big mistake. I think we need to remain engaged and very much as a leader working in concert with allies and like-minded countries.
We're no longer the dominant power that we were even coming out of 1989 and the end of the Cold War. We are one nation, a leading nation, a nation with huge purpose and huge resources, but one among many. And we have to balance our interests with our capabilities and recognize in a multipolar world, we have to build alliances and have to come to terms with adversaries. That's the big challenge before Americans today as they readjust their view of the world and our place in it.
So finally, Robert Grenier, in terms of lessons learned, what the U.S. needs to, lessons the U.S. needs to have absorbed from the terrible experience of 9/11, what would that be?
What is top of mind for me is that we have to be aware and cognizant of the limits of our own power, what we can reasonably accomplish, and to have the discipline and the wisdom to recognize those limits and to act accordingly.
And Kori Schake, lessons?
We ought to have more perspective, keep things in perspective, and have a longer term horizon for sustaining an international order that's very much in the interest of American security and prosperity. And by overreacting to the terrorist threat of 9/11, we squandered a lot of American strength.
And Frank Wisner, you get the last word on this question about lesson.
We need to be very careful, apply ourselves within strictly defined objectives, be careful that we use military force only as a last resort, that we have a preference for political, diplomatic, and intelligence, as well as economic tools as we make our way in the world. But we do not lead with our military force.
Frank Wisner, Kori Schake, Robert Grenier, we thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you.
On the eve of the 20th anniversary of the deadliest terror attack in the country, we're in the midst of another calamity, COVID-19. Here to break down the politics of all this, the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, columnist for The Washington Post. Gentlemen, we've just heard Judy lead a discussion about the foreign policy aspects of all this. And certainly I can, looking back on 9/11, I remember how we felt changed from this. But looking backward at it, how did we change? Are we changed as a people, as a nation, as a political system? David, what's your take?
Well, as a globe, I mean, it was the first act of the 21st century. And so if I was a foreign correspondent in the 1990s, I covered nothing but good news. I covered the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Mandela coming in, end of apartheid, the Oslo peace process, and the theme of the 90s was convergence. China was liberalizing. We were coming more like each other and more communication with each other. We thought the internet was a good thing back then. and 9/11 happens, and a group of terrorists said, no, we don't want to be like you. We reject you. And so that was a shock. And then you have other shocks. The Chinese stops liberalizing. We don't want to be like you. Russia goes to Putin. We don't want to be like that. So the 21st century has been the re-erection of barriers. And the 9/11 was a first shocking foretaste of a much tougher world.
Jonathan, as I recall, you were in New York. You were working for Michael Bloomberg.
Right. I was working on his first of 3 mayoral campaigns in New York City, and it was primary day. And I remember waking up, I lived in a high-rise, so I had a perfect view of the city, and it was a crystal clear day. I remember walking to the voting place, looking up at the sky and thinking, this is a spectacular day. And still to this day, I'd never seen a day like that in New York City. And all hell broke loose later, about 90 minutes later that morning. Lots of things changed that day. We were in the middle of a mayoral campaign. The campaign stopped. At one point, while we're watching the coverage on television, someone just asks out loud, has anyone heard from the mayor? Meaning Rudy Giuliani at the time, who on primary day, everyone in New York was looking forward to turning the page from Rudy Giuliani's mayoralty. And the rest we know is history. I think that in these 20 years, just to add on to what David was just talking about, we've seen a lot of what I think of as one giant step forward and then 2 giant steps back. One giant step forward was the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States, first black president. But a huge step back was the election of Donald Trump as president. Another huge step forward, the election of Joe Biden as president of the United States. Another huge step forward, marriage equality. But another huge step back, to my mind, one was the fact that even though Donald Trump lost election, he got 12 million more votes than he did in 2016. So it just highlights the divisions within the country. And then the ultimate step back, January 6th. My colleague Carlos Lozado said this morning on television that how ironic it is that on September 11th, there were reports that the plane that went down in Shanksville was headed to the Capitol, headed to crash into the Capitol. And yet at almost 20 years later, the Capitol was ransacked by domestic terrorists who lay siege to the US Capitol at a time when the members of Congress was certifying the last election. That was, to my mind, the ultimate step back. And to your point about, the world turning away from democracy, we have that issue here at home right now.
So, Jonathan, you see it. What I hear you saying is that other forces have changed politics more since 9/11 than 9/11.
Oh, I think so. I think MAGA and the domestic terror threat is much more worrisome than any foreign threat we could face.
David?
Yeah, I would agree. I think we thought we had some debates settled. And the settlement was liberal pluralism, democratic capitalism. And the world is sort of evolving away from some sort of primitivism. And then suddenly 9/11 happens. And Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda and then ISIS. So apparently we're not evolving away from that. And then capitalism. Well, 2008, that sort of disillusions that. And then, we're a more diverse nation, Barack Obama. 2016 disillusions that. COVID, we can't function as a people. We've lost faith in each other. And so it's been a sad epoch of disillusionment. Not without good things, as Jonathan said, but you just look at the dumb figure. Do you trust your neighbors? Do you trust the people around you? Generation ago, 50, 60%. Now it's 30%, 19% of millennials. And this is the world they've known. And their distrust is an earned distrust. And so this is the legacy of what we faced in the past 2 decades.
And we are in the midst of another calamity, the pandemic. And as we've been focusing on 9/11 this week, it struck me, someone pointed out to me, that every 2 days this week, with COVID deaths, we have essentially had another 9/11 and also had another 20-year Afghan war in terms of the Americans who've died. This week, or yesterday, the president tried, after resisting mandates,